Picture this. It's a sweltering July morning in 1776, and somewhere in Philadelphia, a group of men in powdered wigs are about to commit what amounts to the world's most expensive act of rebellion. The ink isn't even dry on a piece of parchment that will eventually cost Britain an empire, and cost these men potentially their necks. But let's rewind a bit, because revolutions don't just happen overnight. They simmer like a pot of colonial stew, one grievance at a time. Imagine being a colonist in 1765. You wake up in your wooden home, probably to the sound of roosters and the smell of yesterday's bread. You're planning to buy some tea, because what else would a proper British subject do? Only to discover that King George has decided your morning cup now comes with a lovely little tax stamp. The Stamp Act, they're calling it. Suddenly, your newspaper costs more, your legal documents need expensive stamps, and even your playing cards require royal approval. It's as if someone decided to tax your very existence, one paper product at a time. The thing about the British Empire in the 1760s was its magnificent ability to be tone-deaf. Picture Lord North, the British Prime Minister, sitting in his London office, probably sipping untaxed tea, genuinely puzzled why these ungrateful colonists are making such a fuss about contributing to their own defense. After all, Britain had just spent a fortune protecting them during the 7 Years' War. Surely they wouldn't mind paying for the privilege of being protected. It's rather like charging someone for holding an umbrella over their head during a rainstorm they didn't ask to stand in. By 1773, tensions had reached that peculiar boiling point where rational people start doing irrational things. Take the Boston Tea Party, a name that makes it sound like a delightful social gathering, when in reality it was more like the world's most expensive act of vandalism. Picture Samuel Adams and his merry band of rebels, disguised as Native Americans in what was probably the least convincing costume party in history, methodically dumping 342 chests of perfectly good tea into Boston Harbor. The harbor probably smelled like Earl Grey for months afterward. King George was not amused. The intolerable acts that followed were Britain's way of saying, "Fine, if you want to act like children, we'll treat you like children." Boston's port was closed, Massachusetts lost its self-governance, and suddenly British officials could be tried in England rather than facing local colonial justice. Imagine having your neighbor's dog destroy your garden, only to be told that any disputes would be settled by the neighbor's mother-in-law in another country. The colonists were beginning to see a pattern here. But revolutions need more than just angry merchants and tea-flavored harbors. They need ideas, and fortunately, the colonies were full of men who spent their evenings reading philosophy by candlelight instead of watching whatever passed for entertainment in 1775. Thomas Paine's common sense spread through the colonies like gossip at a church social, making the radical argument that maybe, just maybe, kings weren't appointed by God to rule over everyone else. Revolutionary thinking, literally. The actual fighting began in 1775 with what historians politely call the shot heard round the world, fired at Lexington and Concord. Though nobody quite knows who fired first, which is rather typical of how these things go. One moment, British soldiers and colonial militia are having a tense stare-down like gunfighters in a western, and the next moment, everyone's shooting and the revolution has officially begun. By the time the smoke cleared, the British were retreating to Boston, probably wondering how a simple tax collection had turned into a shooting war. George Washington, meanwhile, found himself commanding what was charitably called an army but looked more like an enthusiastic militia potluck. These weren't professional soldiers marching in perfect formation. They were farmers and shopkeepers who brought their own muskets and occasionally their own ideas about military discipline. Washington spent much of 1775 and 1776 trying to turn this collection of individuals into something resembling a fighting force, while simultaneously keeping them fed, clothed, and convinced that dying for independence was preferable to going home for harvest season. The Continental Congress spent months dancing around the inevitable. Even as battles raged, many delegates still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. It took Thomas Jefferson's eloquent pen to finally articulate what many were thinking but few dared say, that these colonies were, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The Declaration of Independence, signed on July 4, 1776, was essentially a breakup letter to King George, written in the most polite and philosophical language possible while still essentially saying, "It's not us, it's you. And we're keeping the house." What followed was 8 years of warfare that would make a Hollywood producer weep with joy. Valley Forge winters that tested men's souls, unlikely victories against impossible odds, and a French alliance that proved sometimes your enemy's enemy really can become your friend, especially when they're still bitter about losing Canada. The American Revolution succeeded not because it was inevitable, but because enough ordinary people decided that being governed without their consent was less appealing than the uncertain prospect of governing themselves. In coffee houses and taverns, in town meetings and around kitchen tables, colonists talked themselves into believing that they could create something new, a nation built on ideas rather than bloodlines, on consent rather than conquest. By 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed, the impossible had become merely improbable, and then finally, miraculously, real. The colonies that had started as tax protesters had become the United States of America, proving that sometimes, just sometimes, David really can take down Goliath, especially if David has good aim, French allies, and enough stubborn determination to outlast an empire's patience.